Okay. Yes, right. We are probably going to finish this section today. So that means I'll open the test after class, and you will have until at least 5 o'clock on Sunday. I won't close it before 5 o'clock on Sunday. Is that all right? Can you swing that? You sound like
I get off at 5.
I'll leave it till 8.
Thank you.
Hey, if y'all let me know what's going on in your lives, I can be accommodating. You sound like my daughter, though. I can't remember if there was an extra. Oh, there was an extra credit. The Salem thing. I'll cut them both off at the same time. So, just sometime over the weekend, get the test done. This one's not a long one. I think it's actually you'll get 2 extra points with it because if I remember right, it's 28 questions. I don't know why I didn't think of 2 more questions, but that's an odd number when it goes to figuring out final grade, so I'll round it off to 30 and just give everybody 2 points. There'll be a couple people in this class that have 2 points when they're done. Like for this whole grade. They haven't done anything. But it's not too late. If you get on the ball, you can redeem yourself. So I know I'm preaching to the choir because pretty much y'all are the ones who are always here. And if you're here, then I also assume that you're probably doing your test. But maybe somebody else is listening. All right. So we had ended when the Dominion of New England ended. And the end of the Dominion of New England caused another wave of kind of self-government. Things sort of went back to normal, at least from the colonist point of view. Self-government had evolved, and governments in the individual colonies broadly resembled the government in England. You had a governor who was more or less equal, not in stature, but in job description to the king. Now, the ones, and you had an assembly, and it was usually a 2-house system that sort of corresponds with Parliament. Now, in the colonies, though, the governor had powers that the king had lost. As you remember, through the English Civil War and the Glorious Restoration, the king had agreed to share certain powers with Parliament. He lost a lot of his veto powers. The governors had not lost those yet. Also had a lot of power. The governor also had a lot of power of appointment, where he could appoint people to different positions, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is important because that's how you pay off your cronies. That's how you pay off people for political support. That's how you get people's political support. And the legislature already had powers that Parliament had yet to claim. And some of these are appointed powers. Okay, so the governors. The crown, the king in England, never vetoed an act of Parliament after 1707. But the governors could. They could appoint and remove officials. They commanded the militia and the navy. I did say that they can appoint and remove officials, but they're going to start losing that power as time passes, as the king starts claiming the power to appoint his friends to colonial posts, which is going to aggravate the colonials to no end. The assemblies were elected. They could initiate legislature, something that Parliament couldn't do. In most of them, much like Parliament, the lower house was a popular vote. The upper house was appointed. It was more well-to-do, corresponds to the lords and the commoners. Property was your stake in society. And if you owned property and you were a man, you could vote. If you owned property and you were a woman, you still couldn't vote. You couldn't vote if you were an Indian, you couldn't vote if you were an African. White male suffrage, what we're talking about. And you had to be a property owner because they believed that gave you a stake in society. The assemblies controlled the budget by their right to vote on taxes and expenditures. And they often named tax collectors and treasurers, and they're going to slowly stretch that claim to take in other colonial offices. And they're going to rock along for a while. And more or less get along with England until some wars start. And the colonial wars are going to change everything. There's 4 major wars. And they're brought on by discords between the English and the French. When King William II is put in power in England, he is a Reformed Protestant. He absolutely hates Louis XIV, who is an avowed Catholic. And there's a series of wars that start over this disconnect. First, you're going to have, and we're only going to talk about one of them in detail. Now, and remember, you got to remember, we're not Britain's only colony. And Britain rules her colonies. They are the final authority. They're the final authority in any of their colonies, whether it's in India, the West Indies, or in North America. And these colonial wars are going to happen in different places around the world. So the first one, and they also have, all of them have 2 names. Because in the continent, they're called one thing, and the colonies are called something different. King William's War, the colonial name, lasted from 1689 to 1697. In Europe, it was called the War of the League of Augsburg. Then we're going to have Queen Anne's War, which is going to last 11 years, from 1702 to 1713. And that's the War of Spanish Succession. Yeah, the Spanish get involved in this too because they're also Catholic and they back the French. Then we have King George's War from 1744 to 1748. That one's a short one. It only lasts 4 years. And that's the War of Austrian Succession. The one we're interested in is the French and Indian War. It lasts for 9 years. So in Europe, they call it the 7 Years' War. And a lot of it was fought in North America. Some of this is brought on by French colonial activities in the colonies. And I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to talk about that. But in general, this is a devastating war for colonies, for the American colonies. It devastates the population. Over 900 Bostonians alone are going to die in the fighting, leaving a lot of widows and orphans. It's going to lead England into debt because they have to establish, they already have a good standing navy, but they have to expand that because you're having to fight across an ocean, and they have to post a standing army in the colonies. It's going to lead to a very militant sense of nationalism that for a while is going to work in the Brits' favor, and then not so much. It's also truly a world war. They're going to end up fighting on, I want to say, I didn't write it down, three different continents and 4 oceans before it's done. Some background. This is what I was getting ahead of myself with. Some of this is brought on by the French colonial experience. I didn't flip. I'll let y'all write that down and then I'll flip to the next slide. Spain had lost Mexico in 1821. Oh no, why is that even there? Ignore that comment. Sorry about that. The French had explored from Quebec to New Orleans, getting there in 1718. Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne, the Sieur of Bienville, becomes the father of Louisiana. He is going to help settle that area. Now, to get from Quebec to Louisiana, you can go 2 ways. You can go back out on the ocean and sail around and come up through the Gulf, or you can go back country, go down the Appalachians, or past the Appalachians, down the Ohio River Valley to the Mississippi, and down the Mississippi. That is how the French did it. The French, in their colonial efforts, had not sent lots of people. They're probably the smallest group of explorers to come to the New World, and they sent almost all men. And they had absolutely no interest at all in missionary zeal. Now, they were all Catholic. That it was a requirement. So they cut out like the French Huguenots who would have probably settled in farm. But because they had such a small population, it was in their best interest to work with the Indians that they're going to encounter, because you're not going to come down the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi without running into some sort of Native American. A lot of the French married into Indian tribes. They became very cooperative with them. And they had a good relationship. This is going to be important. Ignore that first line. I don't even know why that's in there, so don't write that down. The war has its beginnings when some Virginians crossed over into the Ohio River Valley in the 1750s. That date is also wrong. It's not 1718, it's the 1750s. They began trading with the Indians, and they had a claim for 200,000 acres granted by the king that they began to survey. Now, the Indians aren't necessarily on board with this. They didn't give up their land. It's their land. The French are also not on board with this because they're working in the Ohio River Valley. And they're French. They don't want to be in an English colony. So the French established forts in what is now western Pennsylvania. And And Virginia sends out troops led by a young man named George Washington to tell the French to go away. Our king gave us this, you can't be here, you have to leave. To which the French say, huh, what? No, we don't care. So Washington comes back, rebuked. They were polite, but they still weren't interested, and they had forts set up already. So the Virginia government sends him out again with instructions to build forts at the head of the Ohio River and to oust the French. So where he's going to go is where Pittsburgh is now, and there's 3 major rivers that come together. Unfortunately, the French got there first and built Fort Duquesne. So Washington and his 150 troops head out to build this fort, only to find that the French are already there. I know it's the spring of 1754. So Washington camps nearby, trying to figure out exactly what he needs to do. In the meantime, the French send out a detachment to discuss the fort. I guess they weren't carrying a white flag because the English troops ambushed them. They kill 10, including the commander. 1 guy escapes, 22 are captured. Washington gets his first taste of Indian warfare as he watches his Indian allies that are with him mutilate the bodies of the 10 dead soldiers. Doesn't stop them, probably isn't able to, but he gets to see that. Washington retreats back to what's called the Great Meadows and builds Fort Necessity. Fort Necessity is attacked on July 3rd, 1754. Washington is completely overwhelmed. You got to remember, he's still a young officer, and he surrenders, losing about 1/3 of his force, 100 men. He loses all his cattle, loses all his horses, and the French very kindly allow the 200 remaining soldiers to leave armed, but they're leaving on foot. When they fired on the French and they ambushed that first squadron, they pretty much set the world on fire. They started a war. The English attempt to make peace. They set up a Congress in Albany, New York, called by London officials. They give gifts to the Indians. But they really don't accomplish much. What is examined during this is a plan called the Plan of Union. It's Benjamin Franklin's idea. And he proposes that they need to set up a Grand Council under a chief executive to oversee matters of defense, Indian relations, trade, and settlement of the West that would oversee the entire colonies and be staffed by colonials. Like a colonial government for all of the colonies. Everybody hated the idea. But they did adopt the idea of a supreme commander of British forces in America and a British superintendent of the Northern Indians. Now, the Iroquois are willing to take the gifts and side with the British. The Indians actually were in a pretty good spot. for a long time on the frontier, they held the balance of power. Because they could work with the French or they could work with the English. It was like, who's giving me the better deal right now? And they would switch sides. But when the war starts, the Iroquois are on the side of the British and the colonials. And I can't remember the other two tribes, but I will get to that. So the war starts in 1755. A British fleet captures Nova Scotia, Acadia, expelling the French population. They would have been allowed to stay if they had been willing to become British. But somewhere between 5 to 7 Acadians were forced out for refusing to take the oath of allegiance. They scattered throughout the colonies, but most will finally end up in French Louisiana. Acadian gets corrupted into Cajun, and that's where you get the Cajuns that we have now. Also in 1755, General Edward Braddock arrived in Virginia with 2 regiments of regulars. Now, you need to understand at this time, a standing army was considered a threat by most normal people. And the colonials were no exception, but there's a reason for an army to be here now. But we now have redcoats in the colonies, and they're led by a British general. Braddock was cocky almost to the point of arrogance. He didn't think a lot of the colonial troops. He thought even less of the French and the Indians. And he treated his Indian allies with contempt. Not a good plan. He had no experience in backwood fighting. This is a time when wars were fought by 2 nice little armies walking out and lining up and shooting at each other. Well, the Indians and the French didn't fight like that. The French learned from the Indians. You hide behind trees and jump out at them at the last minute. And, tomahawk them or shoot them or whatever you need to do, but you don't stand out in the open to get shot at. Braddock is a very traditional leader. He did take in some colonial troops, including Washington, and he attempts to haul artillery and supplies out and surround Fort Duquesne and besiege it. 6 miles out, they're ambushed. Braddock is mortally wounded. Washington helps contain the rout and organize a retreat, but before it's over 900 British/Virginians are killed or wounded. 12 captured British soldiers were stripped, bound, and burned at the stake by the Indians. And Braddock's dying comment was, "We shall know better how to deal with them another time." So there was a need to learn some frontier tactics and listen to your Indian allies. In 1756, war is going to break out in Europe. France, Austria, Russia, Saxony, Sweden, and the Swiss all ally up versus Britain, Prussia, and Hanover. At the same time, King George gets a new head of ministry in William Pitt. Now, William Pitt was a very intelligent man, and he was a good planner. And he works really hard to keep the war centered in the colonies. Now, if you look at all these allies, it is definitely a world war. There's a lot of people involved in this. But he's trying to keep the war out of Europe. It's going to eventually take 45,000 troops in North America. Half of those are going to be colonists. And William Pitt worked, excuse me, to make the colonists, this may go on for a while, thank you, feel as if they were partners. He would offer subsidies instead of demands. If you can give me this many troops, I can give you this, rather than you have to give me this many troops. This American First policy fosters a sense of nationalism among the colonists. It's not one colony, it's all of the colonies. They're all working together with the British to fight. But it's still British. It's still a form of British nationalism. They may be all in it together, but they're all in it with the mother country. So we haven't quite shifted yet, but there is this growing sense that we're in this together. They used the Navy to cut off French supplies, which meant the French couldn't give gifts to the Indians to keep them happy. They figured out some frontier tactics, took the fight to the Indians, or to the enemy. I say Indians. The enemy was actually French. The Indians are their allies. And in 1758, the English will capture Fort Louisbourg in Canada. The Iroquois will press the Delawares to call off attacks on English settlements. And they set up for a series of British victories in 1759. Those victories include an offensive against Canada from the Niagara River, Lake Champlain, and the St. Lawrence River. They captured Fort Niagara, with the Iroquois cutting off the interior. General Jeffrey Amherst takes Fort George and Fort Ticonderoga. We'll get back to Fort Ticonderoga. General James Wolfe took out General Louis Joseph de Montcalm at Quebec, pretty much ending French power. They're having similar results in India. And the mop-up is going to continue until 1673. In the meantime, King George II dies, and the throne is taken by his despised grandson, King George III. King George III forces Pitt out. Pitt had wanted him to declare war on Spain before the French could compel the Spanish to enter its port, but the Spanish entered anyway in 1761, but they didn't do any better than the French. And in 1762, the British take Manila and Havana, and the French are ready to negotiate. So in 1763, they meet in Paris to negotiate a treaty. And before it's over, Britain is quite literally going to rule the world. Britain took all of French North American possessions east of the Mississippi, with the exception of New Orleans. They take all of Spanish Florida. The Spanish are invited to stay. The Spanish king orders them to leave and provides transportation to the Caribbean. A few accept, but not many. So you have a mass exodus of the Spanish out of Florida. Spain is going to receive Louisiana, basically New Orleans and everything west of the Mississippi, in exchange for Spanish Florida. And the people who lose out the most are the Indians. They didn't feel the treaty applied to them because they were invited to the table. Also, they never gave the French their property. They were all just hunting on it. And they didn't think that the French had any right to negotiate their land. So then you have a mini war that is going to come out of this, where the Indians take on the British. It's usually referred to as Pontiac's Rebellion, and it's really more a series of small raids rather than one big organized war. But the British man all the forts around the Great Lakes, the Ohio River Valley. The Indians take the Great Lakes forts and the Ohio River Valley forts, and they raid into Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. The Brits attack back. They use biological warfare. So they leave smallpox-infested blankets outside Fort Pitt as a gift. The gift that keeps on giving. Actually, it doesn't give very long because everybody dies. And they, one by one, take back all of the forts. This is going to convince the colonists that there's no working with the Indians, that the Indians need to be removed. But the British government doesn't quite believe that way, and they're going to negotiate with the Indians to set up a demarcation line. Basically, they say these new colonials will not go past a certain area, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Not today, but when we start the next section, because that's when it kind of kicks in. The results of this, and I already said Spain received Louisiana, were that the British successfully threatened the Indians, got them to back down. They got the French out of the area. They get the Spanish out of Florida. It's also going to embolden the American settlers because, hey, we just helped fight a successful war. We're pretty good. From the British government's point of view, they decided that this meant they really needed to tighten down on colonial control, and they needed to spend more on defense for the colonies, and that shouldn't all fall on Britain. That the colonists should be paying a part in their own defense. In 1760, the average Londoner was paying 23 shillings in taxes a year, and the average colonial was paying 1. So from the British point of view, this is pretty one-sided. They're supposed to be British citizens, but they're not paying their share of the taxes. On the other side of the ocean, on the colonial side, yeah, we're not paying as much in taxes, but we don't have anybody representing us in Parliament. So we shouldn't have to pay taxes because Parliament's the only one that can tax us, other than our local assemblies, to which we pay taxes. So we're fine as British citizens. We're doing our due. So you want to give us representation in Parliament. And it also created in France a distinct longing for revenge. The French hate the English at this point. But you got to remember, these colonials are still very British. They celebrate the end of the French and Indian Wars as thoroughly in Boston as they do in London. and they're still very, very British. Okay, we are done early. That is the end of this section. We will get into the American Revolution in the next section. Get your test done by 8 o'clock Sunday. And y'all have a good weekend. Oh, wait, there is one more thing. I can't remember if I told you that Jonathan Edwards said the sermon on sinners in the hands of the angry gods, or if I said it was Whitfield, but it's Edwards. The one in the book is right. I think I can't remember what I said, and I don't want to know that I told you wrong. Because it could be, I don't know if it's on the test, but it could be. It sounds like a question I would ask. Thank you.
Is that test open already?
No.
Okay.
And it will be open in like 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, awesome.
Ms. Lemons, are you going to be posting the PowerPoints from now on, or just was it for this past 2 weeks?
Oh, no, I'll keep posting that.
Okay, thank you.